Canada, our home and native land. This year, many Canadians celebrated the 153rd marking that granted Euro-Canadians and their descendants constitutional freedom from the British Crown. The Canadian Constitution is significant in Canadian history because it provided Euro-Canadians with the power of self-governance. However, my question is, why do we really celebrate Canada Day? Because in my lenses, I do not see anything to hold pride in that the Canadian Constitution has demonstrated throughout history. Why does a nation that confidently prides itself of its multicultural freedom and diversity continue to celebrate a constitution that utilizes its political freedom to oppress and neglect Indigenous people of this land? Well, the answer is simple. It's easier to run over somebody when you view them as less than. That makes sense, right? It's basic psychology. If I were to formulate a belief in which I viewed myself as a superior being and I viewed you as inferior due to the factors that made up your identity, my negative views of your characteristics would eventually affect your self-esteem, environment, and overall stimulate doubt of your self-worth and identity. Well, this is what the Canadian Constitution has bluntly displayed through its discriminatory bills and policies formulated throughout colonial history. Colonialism. One of the most horrific segments in Canadian history. The segments Euro-Canadians try so hard to wash out like they were the victims of the events was the first marking that indicated it was never in Canada's favor for Indigenous people to be healthy. That was thoroughly displayed through the notorious passing of the Indian Act. Although the act was institutionalized many years ago, its taunting segments continue to haunt the lives of many Indigenous people like a dark cloud hanging over their heads. So, let's take a step back in history and thoroughly analyze the discriminatory aspect the Indian Act possessed and how the Canadian Constitution historically utilized the act as a cryptic tactic to formulate an inhumane cycle of intergenerational trauma and poverty within Indigenous communities. Before I begin, can I get a show of hands of how many people know or have heard of the term Indian Act? Well, for those who may not be familiar with the infamous act, the Indian Act is a Canadian Act of Parliament in which the federal government administers Indian status affairs through reserves in Indian bands, which are status tribes. The act was passed in 1876 by the Canadian federal government with the intent of removing the savage out of the Indian due to their beliefs of Indigenous culture inherently being barbaric and inferior to Euro-Canadians' way of life. The main purpose of the act was to assimilate Indigenous people into Euro-Canadian society, which meant forcefully separating Indigenous peoples of their cultural identity. The heinous assimilation scheme had great results in stripping any ties of cultural wealth within Indigenous communities, and it was accomplished via passing of reserves and residential schools. Demonizing Indigenous heritage through the law engraved self-hate and shame within the minds of many Indigenous peoples. The Indian Act also held significant authority on the means of Indigenous identity. According to the original copy of the Indian Act, one could qualify for Indian status if they possessed quote-unquote Indian blood or if they were part of a body of Indians. The legal definition that granted Indian status wasn't certain because not all Indigenous people were granted with Indian status. For example, Indigenous women were discriminated from being granted with Indian status and rights due to the fact that they were women. Also, if an Indian status individual pursued secondary education, they were enfranchised of their Indian status because education tied in with the Euro-Canadian assimilation agenda. Lastly, if an Indian status male left to serve in the Canadian military, they were also enfranchised of their status, which automatically limited all the rights and benefits Indigenous people were granted through the treaty negotiations. Even though the Indian Act managed to terminate the major prejudice discriminatory ideas it proudly possessed throughout colonial history, the Indigenous reality has not changed a single bit. Did you know that child poverty in Indigenous communities is 3 times the national rate of 17.6? That's quite alarming, isn't it? Indigenous reserves are the breeding grounds of poverty and continue to put the lives of various Indigenous peoples in harm's way. Isn't it extraordinarily disappointing to see a nation that prides itself for its international development and aid continuously turn a blind eye to the inhumane living conditions its Indigenous people are constantly faced with? Till this day, various Indigenous communities live on boiled water advisories, which is a sickening reality because we don't even have to think twice before we take a sip from the water that runs through our households. The government has undermined the corrupt education system Indigenous children have been presented with in reserves. Reserves only have elementary schools, and if they're lucky, they're presented with 2. The school system in reserves does not provide any form of education past elementary school, and if a child graduates, they're presented with 2 routes: leave the reserves and their family to attend a high school in a nearby city, or not attend high school at all. As a result of this failing education system provided in reserves, 61% of Indigenous young adults do not complete high school, compared to 13% of non-Indigenous in Canada. Only 14% of Indigenous people residing in reserves have a university degree, compared to 23% of the Canadian population. Not only are Indigenous communities facing a humanitarian crisis, but they're also facing an epidemic of intergenerational trauma that is tearing their communities apart. Many residential school survivors developed various psychological illnesses due to the trauma they endured within the inhumane institutions. Children of survivors are likely to inherit intergenerational trauma due to the toxic environments fulfilled with drug, substance addiction, PTSD, abandonment issues, and other severe mental illnesses and suicides. A study released in 2019 by Canada Statistics indicates there are approximately 2.3 suicides per 100 people each year within Indigenous communities, which is 3 times higher than the non-Indigenous suicide rate. Suicide occurring in reserves is approximately 48.3 per 100 people, which is double the amount of Indigenous people living off reserves. People are dying. Indigenous people are dying, and yet the government continues to not pay mind to their struggles. So what? Well, the government of Canada has focused their attention on reconciling with Indigenous people of Canada since 2008. However, not much has changed because the government continues to ignore the pain and misery Indigenous people endure via neglect of housing, education, mental illnesses, and suicide rates. Unless the government takes a form of leadership in decreasing the destruction within Indigenous communities, the chances of reconciliation will decrease and the apologies will remain vile.